Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode will be an interview about the Zhuangzi with Hans-Georg Moeller, who is professor of philosophy at the University of Macau. Hello, Hans-Georg.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to talk about the Zhuangzi, which is a very popular text. So a lot of professional scholars of Chinese philosophy work on it. And it's also, I think, maybe the most popular Warring States text to recommend to the general reader. And so when Karen and I were talking about what to ask you, the first question we came up with is basically why. So is it just because it's funny? Is it because it's engagingly written? And maybe a kind of corollary to that would be, why is it that it's written that way? So what's the philosophical point of having all these anecdotes about talking animals and so on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I guess this is directly connected to what I regard as one of the main differences between Confucianism and Daoism, namely the fact that, at least in my reading, Daoism is decidedly non-anthropocentric. So it makes a lot of sense to have animals in there and other non-human, let's say, protagonists in the stories. So that is one major reason, I think. A second reason, which is directly connected to the first one, is I think one of the main critiques by Taoism of Confucianism is against, let's say, the Confucian political and moral practice as a kind of domestication regime. And interestingly enough, a lot of the animals in the Zhuangzi and in these stories are non-domesticated animals, whatever, fish and bird and so forth. My friend Graham Parks pointed out that many of them are not even mammals, which indicates the difference from anthropocentrism. I agree with that, but I would specify that this non-domesticable animals represent a form of resistance against the, let's say, Confucian domestication regime. So that is a second aspect of why I think that there are so many animals and what kind of animals specifically. The third aspect is, of course, the incongruity. A lot of early Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, but by no means only Confucianism, as a main form of philosophizing, it uses historical anecdotes where people, especially wise people, speak. And this emphasis on animals has a very strong incongruity effect. We already have this similar in other cultures, many other cultures, also the Greek fables are very famous. So it has an aspect of incongruity, absurdity, humor, which not only challenges the anthropocentric view, but also somehow comically, ironically, satirically undermines the pretense of human wisdom.
Now that you point that out, it makes me realize that it also casts doubt on even what you might call the historical reliability of the anecdotes about the humans. So if you go back and forth between talking animals and Zhuangzi talking to Kongzi or whatever, then it calls attention to the literary artifice of presenting Kongzi as if you're just reporting something that he genuinely did. And it's almost like it indirectly casts doubt on the anecdotes about Kongzi back in the Analects, for example.
Absolutely. It shows that these historical anecdotes are not really, let's say, reliable. And again, it has this challenge, it challenges the authority of the philosophical figures that is normally unquestioned ascribed to them.
I think one of the other reasons we suggest reading the Zhuangzi to non-specialists is that it's just so funny.
Right.
For example, the scene where the monkeys don't want 3 nuts in the morning and 4 nuts in the afternoon, they want it the other way around, or Robert Zhu, the gangster, or actually I presented the happy fish passage a few times to audiences and they laugh when they read it. I guess they laugh because it's clever, maybe more than that it's funny. But the Zhuangzi really seems very committed to this idea that philosophy should be funny. And again, I think that is worth thinking about why that would be.
Yes, that's for me, that's very central. And I like all these stories you mentioned, and also the happy fish story is one of my favorite stories from the Zhuangzi. And again, I think the humor has two main, very central philosophical functions. I would say it's much more important in the Zhuangzi than, for instance, argumentation. And the two major functions, the first I already mentioned is critique, right? And we have this also nowadays in our society, not so much in philosophy. A lot of critique is expressed through comedy, right? We have stand-up comedians, we have all forms of satirical form of critique of power. So I do think that this is universal. And again, this also goes back to early cultures elsewhere, like in Greece or so. So that the critique of power in a kind of the Russian literary scholar Bakhtin uses the word the carnivalesque, right? That the carnivalesque is a very powerful tool of critique, including also philosophical critique. Arguably, even more importantly, with respect to the Zhuangzi and Daoist philosophy in particular, is the therapeutic effect of humor. That humor provides not just relief, but I think the main goal, and that's not my own wording, that's the scholar Norman Girardot who put it like this, that if he would have to summarize the approach of Taoism to philosophy, he calls it medicinal. And humor, in a sense, in a communicative sense, and also in a kind of mindset sense, has a very strong medicinal therapeutic function. And we have also modern philosopher Wittgenstein talking about the therapeutic function of philosophy. I regard the Taoist approach, especially the approach of the Zhuangzi to philosophy, as a kind of therapeutic mode rather than, for instance, a normative mode. And humor is practical Taoism, right? It is a performative, practical form of philosophy that produces that which Taoism is about, namely ease, or Yo, the famous title of the first chapter of the Zhuangzi, translated sometimes as carefree wandering. So, in a practical, communicative, mental form, humor produces ease, and that's, I think, is the main function. I would like to add something about the humor thing, namely about the topic of humor. That is that the humor is also interpersonal, right? So humor is not just, let's say, for a reader who reads a book, but we have many of these dialogues. We have a kind of dialogical philosophy that is going on there. So I would like to stress that which is actually a goal that is not so different from Confucianism, the goal to produce something like social harmony, social well-being. So if you interact and if you kind of practice humorous, easygoing mode of philosophy, that's not just for the single individual, the silent reader, but that's very much for the dialogical practice of philosophy and interaction. I wanted to add that because I think that's important.
When you put it like that, it makes one think then any Taoist text should be funny and maybe full of anecdotes as well. And yet
Yeah.
we have these two classic Taoist works from the Warring States period, the
Mm.
Zhuangzi, which we've been talking about, and then the Lao Tzu, or the Tao Te Ching, if you want to call
Yes.
it that, which is very different. I don't remember laughing when I read the Lao Tzu.
Mm.
And there's also no stories about talking animals in it
Yeah.
that I can remember. So the Zhuangzi obviously refers to the Lao Tzu and is very influenced by it.
Yes.
But do you think that they're just using different strategies to get at the same kind of goal, or what's going on there?
You are right that the tone and the language of the Laozi and the Zhuangzi are very different. There is little, if not no humor at all in the Laozi. And I see the relation nevertheless, I see a very close relation between the Laozi and the Zhuangzi. The Laozi is a very short, very obscure book. It's very difficult to decipher, not just for contemporary readers. I'm sure it intentionally speaks in riddles. So it's a hermetic text in a sense. And the Zhuangzi is not at all hermetic. So it opens up the Laozi. But as you said, there are many references, explicit, implicit, direct, indirect references to the Laozi. I basically think that the Zhuangzi takes many of the concepts, of the ideas, the language of the Lao Tzu, and then transforms it into a narrative, as we already discussed, humorous, dialogical form of philosophizing that is much more approachable.
Right. And so it's using a different set of strategies to get to the same ideas.
Yes.
Could it also be a function of when they were written? So the Lao Tzu is written at a time when this kind of very compressed aphoristic style would have been.
I think we want to have a specialist discussion here that the Lao Tzu was not literally written. And I guess many scholars agree that it comes from oral sources. And it is a collection of sayings that, again, are very cryptic, obscure, that are similar to riddles, that are similar to divinatory language, and so forth. And that it was a very different genre of, let's say, early philosophizing coming out of an oral tradition. And I do think that the Zhuangzi is already much more literary.
I see. So we might actually be dealing with something like a transition from oral to written culture there. Something else people talk about with the Greeks, actually, like the pre-Socratics as
Yeah.
opposed to Plato, for example. That's really
Yes.
interesting. Okay. We could probably spend the whole time talking about the way the Zhuangzi is written, but let's get on to
Yeah.
some
It's
specific
very complex.
philosophical themes. We have focused in our episodes a lot on issues around epistemology. So we talked a lot about relativism. We talked about death. We talked about aimless wandering or carefree wandering, as you mentioned. And something that you're interested in that we haven't talked about so much is ethics. And here, maybe one could even doubt whether the Zhuangzi is an ethical text. Like, how does the Zhuangzi want us to live, apart from wanting us to be carefree? Do you think that it's recommending any particular way of life or approach to ethical issues?
I personally read the Zhuangzi as an amoral text. So I do not read it as a moral or as a, not even in a more narrow sense, ethical text. An ethical text, yes, but only in the wider sense of being about well-being, being about the good life. But somehow paradoxically regarding a moral language and moral argumentation and a moral mindset as not helpful for well-being. Rather, I think, again, I'm using here a phrase by the Russian literary scholar Mikhail Bakhtin, the notion of moral fear. The idea that moral regimes are stress inducing, that they are fear inducing. And I regard Taoism as a form of antidote to the moralistic regimes that were practiced in early Chinese society and that produced a lot of negative side effects that were not producing virtue, that were producing a lot of hypocrisy, that were producing actually a lot of violence. I think there are many parallels, actually. Just teaching a class on Nietzsche and always try to like to point out the parallels between Nietzsche and Taoism. Because if you read Nietzsche, the genealogy of morality, you also see that morality does not really come from morality, at least not for Nietzsche, but that it is a form, again, my language of communication and thinking that sort of covers up many non-moral and actually many immoral things. And I think that the Zhuangzi has a very similar approach of deconstructing the pathologies, the social and the psychological pathologies that are imposed on society as a whole and our human interactions, but also on individuals, the psychological and behavioral pathologies resulting from very moralist regimes. And again, that it uses humor to, again, in Nietzsche's terminology, to find a way of living and find some form of ease beyond good and evil, outside of, let's say, the moral register. And yes, it's about, again, a therapeutic approach that does want to increase well being. And if you want to call that ethics, then I'm fine with that. But it is, in my view, at least, an amoral ethics.
It's almost like a form of eudaimonism that doesn't have any commitment to the concept of virtue, right?
Yes, virtue, but not virtue in the moral sense, but to virtue in the amoral sense. Just again, the vitality, right? And the early meaning of both the word virtue in Latin as well as the word de in Daoism, which later means virtue, like in Dao De Jing. In Dao De Jing, the title de does not mean virtue. It means power, vitality, I think is a good thing. So a pre-moralist understanding of virtue.
Yeah. And the Greek word arete, which we translate virtue, means excellence. And for
Yes,
example, with the skill stories, the wheelwrights and the
right.
butchers and so on, they have virtue in that sense, right? They have excellence, but they're not displaying necessarily something like courage or temperance or justice, right?
Yes, exactly. And there's no normative approach. There's not a kind of an attempt to establish, let's say, moral rules or very kind of strict distinction between what is morally good and what is morally evil. Rather, the opposite is happening in the text.
The Confucians, if we now think some more about the contrast with the Confucians, they maybe have rules, but what they really have is roles. So the role of
Yeah,
the father towards the son, the role of the ruler towards the subject, etc. Right? And it seems from what you've been saying that again, the Taoists in general, the Zhuangzi in particular, would probably reject the idea that the point of life is to carry out a certain role in a certain way. So in some of what you've written about this, you've talked about genuine pretending, which
right,
sounds very unlike what the Confucians would say, be genuinely genuine, don't pretend at
right,
all, right? So you have to be fully
right,
committed, right? Like the child should be
right.
carrying the dishes to the table as if they were made of porcelain and so on.
Yes, exactly. The scholar Roger Ames, famous living Canadian scholar, one of the most famous, influential Western scholars working on Confucianism, he wrote a book called Confucian Role Ethics. And I have greatest respect for Roger Ames, both as a scholar and as a person. And I agree with his depiction of Confucianism as a form of role ethics. He coined that notion of role ethics. And he says several times in his writings that really the point is not just to play your roles, but to live your roles. We have this notion of playing your roles. And I think he's right that this is what Confucianism is about. And I think the Taoist critique of Confucianism is against this idea that we're not supposed to play our roles, but that we are supposed to live our roles in a sense that we orient our formation of our sense of selves entirely to our roles. We identify very strongly, behaviorally, mentally, spiritually, if you want, with our roles. And that this form of very strong identification with roles is also potentially pathological, an over identification with roles, and that it actually prevents us from being able to play them. And play does not, for me at least, and from a Taoist perspective, does not have a negative meaning, right? If we are capable of playing our roles, again, this brings us back to what I said earlier, that might actually be a more easygoing, a more, let's say, a productive way of living our roles as playing them. And for us, for Paul D'Ambrosia and I, we wrote this book about Taoism, which is titled Genuine Pretending. And the term genuine pretending was actually coined by Paul, not by me. But when he coined this term pretending, we were also thinking about pretending in the English sense of child play, right? And the basic idea is that we develop our sense of self, and we think that is universally the case, through pretending in that sense, that we develop a sense of self through practicing a form of orientation to any form of identity. And in many traditional societies, it is through orientation towards roles. And then we act in this way, we think in this way, we have routines and so forth that strengthen and build up this sense of identity, because we're not born with a sense of self, right? So we somehow must learn to build this sense of self. So in that sense, an identity is something that is always pretend, that is built through pretense. And through this pretense, only then it becomes genuine. It's not genuine in the beginning. So for us, genuine pretending is a universal existential concept. Everyone is always genuinely pretending, everyone who has an identity. Each and every identity is genuinely pretended. And then the idea is that if we understand the contingency that is inherent in genuine pretend, then it will be easier for us to actually play these identities in a more relaxed way, not being too obsessed about them, because none of them is perfect. And for me personally, the paradigmatic story is the most famous story of the Zhuangzi, the butterfly dream story. I think it's a complete misreading to read it as a story about reality and illusion, which is the normal reading in modern times, which I think is a westernized reading. But I think it is about genuine pretending that all identities are contingent, all identities are transitory. And that if we understand that and realize that, then we can live and play our identities with an increased level of ease. So that is the notion of genuine pretending.
In the Zhuangzi, there's this concept of walking two roads. And when we were talking
Yes.
about this in a previous episode, we presented that as taking ironic distance on what you're doing. And so I'm
Right.
wondering if that's the same idea.
That's part and parcel of it, right? Because it, again, as I said earlier, it allows us to understand the contingency of our roles and that there is an element of coincidence in it. We didn't choose whatever our gender and our gender roles, right? So I think gender is a good example for this, right? Of course, like you and I are genuinely, I guess, men. We genuinely identify as men and we have no other option. But we can nevertheless understand that this gender identity, which we both genuinely feel and enact, is contingent.
Yeah. And culturally constructed and so on.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
And that may somehow provide some relief from having this idea that we must be the perfect man,
yeah.
right?
Oh,
Which
so
can be very stressful.
yeah, that takes us back to the carefree wandering idea, right? And the kind
Yeah.
of therapeutic angle.
Yes.
Something that's come up a lot in this conversation is the way that Zhuangzi is reacting to, especially Confucianism. And that makes me wonder whether that's somehow an essential feature of the Zhuangzi. Like it couldn't have been written if there hadn't been some opponents to react to, which I think is less true of the Lao Tzu, actually.
I agree 100% with the first part that it is a book written in reaction to other philosophy, and for instance, Confucianism. But I would say that is equally true for each and every philosophy work.
Mm.
Each and every philosophy work is somehow in reaction to other philosophy works and other works.
I like that
And I
idea,
think
actually.
it is very
Yeah.
important to somehow understand in which way each and every philosophy works reacts to other works. I think that is key to understanding basically any philosophy book.
Mm-hmm.
If I may say so, that's somehow how I learned, how I was educated in philosophy, because I was trained in Germany. And the German approach to philosophy is historical. I was trained in Bonn University, which was at that time the only philosophy we did was German idealism. And of course, if you read Hegel, that's what you get then, that philosophy is always somehow in a, let's say, dialectical relation to the history of philosophy. It is embedded in it. And if you abstract it from its historical context, then you really miss the core.
Yeah. I'm not a Hegelian, but that really speaks to me what you just said. In fact, in a way, that's the motivation underlying this whole podcast project, right? Like, why do we do the history of philosophy without any gaps? Because if you have gaps, then you don't know what people are reacting to. So by definition, you don't understand what they're doing.
Exactly. That's also why I like your podcast and why I think it's very important.
Okay, thanks. That's like the big picture. Before we close, let me ask you one other question, though, about people reacting to other people within this Chinese tradition. We haven't gotten to the legalists yet, the Fa thinkers, but that's the next thing we're doing. And there's a really strange thing about the most famous legalist author, Han Feizi. which is that you would think this guy would have no interest in Taoism at all, right? So he's a kind of brutally realist political thinker, at least that's what people say about him. And yet he was clearly really interested in the Lao Tzu and reacts to it in his writings. And that makes me wonder what these two traditions could possibly have to do with each other than being antithetically opposed.
Well, I think they're very close. And I actually also wrote my PhD dissertation a long time ago about Huang Lao philosophy, is that form of Taoism in Qin Dynasty, early Han Dynasty, which is a mixture between Taoism and legalism. So we can basically see in the beginning, Lao Tzu is, in my reading, but this is also most scholars share that reading, that it originally was a political text. So it is not surprising that we have the earliest surviving basically commentary to the Lao Tzu's Hanfei, which includes a few chapters commentating on Lao Tzu chapters. And so I definitely think that of all the early Chinese philosophies, legalism is indeed the closest in many ways to Daoist philosophy. And it takes a lot of clues from the Lao Tzu, not so much from the Zhuangzi, but from the Lao Tzu. It's, so to speak, let's say, a heretic reading of the Lao Tzu compared with the Zhuangzi. It's really strongly indebted to, again, the same vocabulary that the Zhuangzi is referring to, but it does something completely different with it. And one key notion is the notion of Wu Wei, which of not acting, if you want to translate it literally. I suppose you spoke in the podcast more about this, so I don't need to address it in detail here. But then this notion of Wu Wei is, I think, key to the political philosophy of legalism, where the point is that the ruler, it's a concretization of the very obscure, let's say, maxim of Wu Wei in the Lao Tzu, which then in legalism in the Hanfei becomes extremely clear and precise. And the idea, simply put, is that the ruler shouldn't have any personal intentionality, and also not even any personal emotionality. So absolute calmness, lack of emotion, and most importantly, lack of intentionality, because usually politicians have intentions and they have emotions, and that what corrupts them. So the idea of the ruler legalism is, how can we get rid of corruption? How can we have a ruler who's completely empty? Right? This notion of emptiness is very central to the Lao Tzu. And the ruler should be at the center of everything, but he should be completely empty of personal interests or personal emotions or personal feelings, of desires. And in this way, we have Ziran. We have a natural form of the Tao can take its course naturally, unimpededly, by a potentially corrupted and corrupting ruler. That is, I think, the key idea to legalism, which comes directly from Taoism, directly from the Lao Tzu.
Yeah, okay. So that's a little glimpse forward of what we're going to be doing next. Mm-hmm. It's actually not the very next thing we're going to do, because this is episode 49. So that means the next episode is episode 50. So we have something special planned for that, which will be a 3-way conversation between me, my co-author and host, Karen Lai, and Brian Van Norden. So the three of us will be looking back at basically everything we've done so far. So the Warring States schools, the main Warring State schools, apart from the legalists. So that's an exciting thing to look forward to. For now, though, I'll thank Hans-Georg Moeller very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you again.
And I'll invite the audience to join us next time as we talk to Brian Van Norden, and then also for the episodes on legalism that will follow that, here on The History of Philosophy in China.